you cannot be fighting in the domestic arena where your closest associates are leaving office and exposing you, and also fighting externally, fighting Russia and fighting many interests. And I think that that is why he has great appetite now to broker some kind of deal. It may not be a deal that resolves the problem at once, but you can start with détente. You can have an armistice, you can have a rapprochement, and have a period within which you stabilize so that you deal with the things that will lead to the stoppage of war and deal with the long-term issues. And once you do that, you will then be able or be in a position to go back into the domestic arena and reorganize your administration, reorganize it to deal with the question of reconstruction, to deal with the question of punishment of the perpetrators of corruption, at least punish a few of them, and then think of an election which will give the administration legitimacy. And I think those are the kind of things that the Trump administration will be confronting his delegation, which is headed or is already in Washington, that this is the reality. And this reality tells us only one story. Your own administration is in trouble. There may be internal rebellion. So deal with this situation in a manner of speaking, paddle the water while it is knee deep, because if you don't, it will be neck deep and you will not be able to paddle it. I think that when you are negotiating from a standpoint of weakness, sometimes you may make concessions that you would not have made if there were no difficulty. So I think the deal is going to be easier to deal with. I'm not saying that it's a done deal, but you are dealing with a person who is wounded. You are dealing with a person who is now threatened both at home and abroad, and that person may very well do things that a few months ago he would not have done. That is the reality, and that reality is one that must be confronted. It is a reality that is going to inform decisions. It is a reality that is forcing the forces around Zelensky to engage in what is called realpolitik. And realpolitik sometimes requires that you do things that are not palatable to all, but necessary. You can never say never, but remember that the Western countries have always said that there are frozen funds from Russia in the neighborhood. The figures vary, of about even 300 billion, and that will be used for purposes of reconstruction of Ukraine. But there are countries that are now beginning to say, why are we spending so much money in a country where the money we spend is being embezzled? So that in the streets of London, people and the parliaments of London, that question will be asked in Germany, it will be asked in Denmark, it will be asked in Paris, it will be asked in Brussels, they'll ask those questions. And there are people who are already saying, oh, so we are giving them money and they are stealing that money. Why should we continue to do so? So we are going to begin to hear many voices which are saying we cannot continue this war because it is becoming a conduit for embezzlement of taxpayers' money from countries that are investing in it. And I think that that is a reality that we are going to see sooner rather than later. You know, sometimes when I look at Europe, I see a power struggle that you see between particularly Britain and France. These are countries whose dominance has been waning over the years. The French have been losing their territories in Africa, and that has implications. The British are weakened both domestically and otherwise. The Germans have always been restrained after the World War, but are beginning to reassert themselves. So Macron is trying to project himself as the European leader. And you can see that. He's saying, I'm the one who has been around for the longest. You, Keir Starmer, came the other day. You, German Chancellor, came the other day. But I'm the person who has been the oldest boy in the block. So therefore, as the Americans would say, I'm the big kahuna, and I want my word to be the word. And you can see that he is trying to do that very frequently. And even in Italy, people like Prime Minister Meloni sometimes are restrained by the very gung-ho approach that we see Macron using in terms of what sometimes may be characterized as gunboat diplomacy. So it is a contestation of the European powers, with Macron trying to project himself as the big European leader. Do the Ukrainians have faith in any European leader now? You can see that they are veering much more to the United States of America, because they know that there is also a lot of doublespeak on the part of the French. And the French themselves do also have domestic contradictions. So they may appear to be strong by dint of the rhetoric of their leader, but internally they are becoming weaker and weaker. And if there is anybody who advises the Zelensky administration properly, he must now know that the Europeans are actually the lapdogs of the United States of America, and when Washington coughs, they go into a coma. And it is better to listen to Washington rather than Paris, London, or Bonn, or Brussels. If there was a word to be coined, it would be said transactional diplomacy. That is the Trump approach. And that diplomacy is the one that has characterized all these negotiations. Even earlier with Ukraine, he said, I want your resources. I broke a peace. When one looks at the relationship between Western Europe and Russia, one must go into history, and that history is well known. If you look at the history of Europe over the years, culminating in the partitioning of African countries in Berlin in 1884 and 1885, they were a colonizing machine, saying we are going into the world, first of all, to civilize the world. And once we've civilized the world, we will also take their resources. So it was always a battle of resources. Russia was not a colonizer that participated in the scramble for Africa. And if you look at that history, when the struggle for independence of many countries grew in earnest, Russia, then of course under the Soviet Union, was always inclined to the oppressed. And that, I think, is what brought about the bad blood, this idea of contestation, that Russia is seen as a counterweight, being allied to the people that were dominated by Western Europe, whether that Western Europe is represented by the British, the Germans, the Italians, the French, the Belgians, the Danes, the Norwegians, and all these happened at different settings. If you go to the World War I, we see how it happened, how the Russians at that time participated. In the World War II, we saw the iconic meetings that were held with the Russian leader and the American leader and the British leader at that time. And we saw the whole idea of the post-World War scenario where, in the words of Winston Churchill, an iron curtain had been drawn. So it became an ideological war. An ideological war that you had a Russia or a Soviet Union at that time that was articulating a different system of governance, a different economic system, seen to be competing with the West. And when the countries acquired independence, whether they were in Africa or in Latin America or in Southeast Asia, there was always this ideological competition. So Russia is seen as this competitor with an alternative economic agenda, with an alternative political agenda, with an alternative cultural agenda. And you cannot ignore her because her size is such that it is several times the size of Europe. The largest Russia now, as we know it, is the largest by land mass on earth with resources. It is a nuclear power. Therefore, you cannot bully her. So what do? You try to weaken her. You try to ensure that her neighborhood is unsafe. That is how you celebrate when the Russian Federation and the satellite states are taken apart with the collapse of the Soviet Union. That is why you lionize Mikhail Gorbachev when he comes with glasnost and perestroika, because you are seeing those as arrows that are pointed into the heart of Russia, and you think that Russia is going to collapse after glasnost and perestroika, and somehow it continues to emerge and to redefine itself. So it is, in my view, those wars that make Russia an arch enemy of the West. And even when you find an American president who wants to be inclined to Russia, you do everything in your power to ensure that the relationship is poisoned. And that is why, for example, when President Putin and President Trump appeared to be enjoying some camaraderie, they were not very happy with that. And they were very happy when that relationship appeared to be headed south. Remember that Europe as we know it still suffers from what I call colonial hangover. That hangover of being the hegemon of the world is threatened at several levels. Initially, of course, it was taken over by the United States of America, but now threatened by Russia, legitimately, threatened by China, legitimately. And you cannot expect that they will sit pretty. They'll do everything in their power to have an indirect confrontation with Russia, because they cannot afford the luxury of having direct confrontation, because this is a nuclear power, which in 1 week can decimate all the major cities in Europe. You don't want to do that. The relationship between Trump and any country is one that you actually watch on a daily basis because you cannot say that this is how it's going to pan out. And of course, one of the things that he said is that Europe must now pay for her defense. And you can see the reaction in Europe is that of enhancing their defense spending. Even countries such as Germany, which were very reticent, are now moving in the direction of enhancing their expenditure. They are beginning to realize that the protection of the United States of America, which they took for granted, is no longer available for the asking. And as Trump himself said, between Russia and the United States, there is a big, beautiful ocean. So that if there is any war, that war will be fought in Europe and Eurasia. And the Americans will be far removed. So the Europeans, in my view, are in a panic mode. They don't know what to do. They appear to know what to do, but they don't know what to do. Because Trump's foreign policy is ambivalent. One time he's with them, but one time he appears to be tangoing with the Russians, appearing to be tangoing with the Turkey, tangoing with the Chinese, tangoing with Brazil. So you never quite can take the pulse of the diplomatic orientation of the United States of America. And we know that Trump is very transactional. He wants a deal made, and that deal, it doesn't matter whether you are making the deal with the devil or with the angels, but let the deal be made. And Europe, for the first time in a long time, are in a state of permanent uncertainty. It is not a good place to be in. You do not know whether it is summer or winter or autumn or spring. The season can change minute by minute. I was listening to Pope Leo during his visit to Turkey, and he was talking about peace. And I think one of the commentators said that, in fact, the world war is already being fought piecemeal. You see wars in Ukraine, you see it in Gaza, you see the conflict between Pakistan and Afghanistan, you see the war between Thailand and Cambodia, and you see little wars or little conflicts and skirmishes in different parts of the world. One sees a world that is very volatile. You see the gunboat diplomacy that is taking place between the United States of America and Venezuela, and it must worry one. So that peace is going to be a very unhappy commodity, in my view, in the next 10 years. Those who are in the business of peacemaking will be running around like headless chicken trying to mediate peace, because war is also a multi-billion-dollar industry, and people are trying to ensure that there is this or that conflict, thinking that they can control and contain. But one day, a single mistake is going to take place, and somebody, wittingly or unwittingly, unleashes a nuclear device. Then the world will never be the same again. And that is why I think that an institution such as the United Nations could be doing more in terms of trying to ensure that the flashpoints we see in the world are addressed very quickly, and not just the symptoms. My fear is that in addressing many of the conflicts that are taking place in the world, we are dealing with the symptoms. And as long as you deal with the symptoms, the underlying causes are ignored, and the skirmishes or the conflicts will arise again and again. Difficult times. Zelensky has taken the country to war. And I'm sure within his ranks there are people who think that he has been responsible for the plight of Ukraine. There are people who, in my view, legitimately think that this war could have been avoided. There are people who legitimately think that he was forced into this war. I personally would not be surprised if there are people within Ukraine who would even say that he be prosecuted. I wouldn't be surprised. His best bet, if the war ends and he does not seek a new mandate, is possibly to find refuge somewhere in Western Europe and watch the events from afar. This is a cliche that the only thing that we learn from history is that we learn nothing from history. The history is very reasoned that a country such as Russia, or indeed any civilization, is not very easy to eliminate. And one has seen a Europe that is preparing for war, recruiting young people into their army, increasing defense expenditure, characterizing Russia as this expansionist country that has the agenda of destroying the entire continent of Europe and our civilization. But the preferred position would be that there should be some understanding with Russia and to integrate Russia within the entire space that is Europe. Of course, Russia is both in Europe and in Asia, so we talk about Eurasia. But look at the Russian